Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is you may be calling in from. My name is Susanne Katus from eRevalue. I will be joining today's conversation in place of Mariela Alma. So look forward to joining today's conversation where we'll be looking at the equal opportunity reality, diversity and inclusion, who runs the world. I think it's a very timely discussion, especially for us here in the United States. If anyone had the opportunity to hear Michelle Obama's speech last night at the Democratic National Convention, one comment she made is, we now live in a society where our sons and daughters can take for granted the fact that a woman can actually be president. So who runs the world? Let's see. In today's discussion, we'll talk a little bit about what diversity and inclusion means within the context of business, and how that interacts with the different expectations of investors, of regulators, and of the public. I'm very excited to be joined by some esteemed speakers today. Today we have with us Kimberly Davis, who is Senior Managing Director and Head of Teneo's Corporate Responsibility and Inclusive Leadership Practice. Kim has designed and built the Teneo Leadership Institute, a partnership with Cornell Johnson School of Business and the Billie Jean King Leadership Initiative. This is an ambitious endeavor focused on engaging CEOs and those in power around the issues of inclusion and talent management. Kim was formerly Managing Director of Global CSR and President of the JP Morgan Chase Foundation. Throughout her 20-plus years at JP Morgan Chase and its predecessor companies, Kim held positions of increasing responsibility in both line and staff leadership roles. Kim is a trustee of Spelman College and a chairman of the HR committee. She is also a trustee of the Canaan Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and serves on Deloitte's External Advisory Council and the board of the BNY Mellon Foundation, amongst many other accomplishments. Thank you so much, Kim, for joining today. Also on the line, calling in from Luxembourg, we have Hedda Pahlson-Moller, who is a business angel focused on social investing. She is currently CEO of OMSINT and TIIME, as well as sits on the boards of the European Venture Philanthropy Association, the European Business Angel Network, as well as the Luxembourg Microfinance and Development Fund. Hedda co-founded the Impactory, now proudly merged with Business Initiative in Yoko, and the seed capital fund Chamelon Invest. Hedda's social impact activities are run through her investing and advisory firm OMSINT. Hedda is also an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship at Sacred Heart University's Executive MBA program and teaches business policy at the European University's MBA program. Thanks so much for joining us, Hedda. We also have Evan Harvey. Thank you. We also have Evan Harvey on the line. So Evan is currently Director of Corporate Responsibility for NASDAQ, as well as Chair of the World Federation of Exchanges Sustainability Working Group, which is actually the largest working group of the WFE. At NASDAQ, Evan manages all corporate sustainability, philanthropic, and volunteering efforts. This includes internal management of systems and disclosures, as well as external engagement with issuers, investors, advocacy groups, and other stock exchanges. Amongst other things, Evan also sits on the U.S. Network Board of the United Nations Global Compact and is an advisory board member of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Evan's calling in from Washington, D.C., where he lives. Thanks for joining us, Evan.
Happy to be here.
Great, and brief introduction, as I mentioned earlier, my name is Susanne Katus. I lead business development activities for eRevalue. eRevalue is a women-led software as a service company based in London and with an office in New York City. With cognitive technology and big data analytics, we help companies understand the latest reputational, regulatory, and compliance risks related to emerging issues, workforce diversity and inclusion being one of those issues. Before eRevalue, I worked with Global Reporting Initiative. So I think a common thread that really connects all of us speaking today is the importance of transparency and open dialogue between communities and their different external stakeholders. Thanks so much, speakers, for joining us today, and especially to all of you attending the webinar. We really hope that this is a lively discussion. So very quick housekeeping rules, as you may have realized already. You, as an attendee, you are automatically muted. That's just to ensure sound quality. If you do have a question, please type that question into your chat box. We will monitor the questions as they come in, but we'll really dedicate the last 20 minutes of the webinar to following up on those questions. We want this to be a very interactive discussion, so please feel free to type those in throughout. There will also be an opportunity for you to provide your views during a poll, and that will actually come up quite shortly. So before we turn over to the speakers, just setting the stage a bit, why the hype? I'm sure diversity and inclusion is a topic of discussion at your organizations, whether that be a corporate, whether that be an NGO, whether that be a university, academic institution, research institution. And what we're seeing is that the issue of diversity and inclusion has been raised in the public eye in recent years. And research increasingly demonstrates that companies with a diverse and inclusive workforce outperform their peers by a significant margin. So on the screen here, you see just a few facts based on that research from entities like McKinsey, Credit Suisse, and Katus. So what this research shows is that the likelihood of companies to financially outperform peers when they have more diverse and inclusive workforces is quite evident. The McKinsey research that you see on the top here, it comes from their latest report, Diversity Matters, in which they examined proprietary data sets for 366 public companies across a range of industries in Canada, Latin America, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The research looked at metrics such as financial results and the competition of top management and boards. And as you can see here, what it shows is that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to have financial outperformance compared to their industry median peers. What we also see is that companies with one or more women on the board have delivered higher average returns on equity over time. With that, we do see that there's a trend towards corporate boards being predominantly male and predominantly run by white men. The bottom stat here, I think, is one of interest and concern for many of the speakers on today's call, so that's something that we'll look at a little bit today. What does it mean to actually have a diverse and inclusive workforce? Before we actually jump into the details, I think it's important that we set the stage and really define what diversity and inclusion means for each of the speakers, but also within the context of today's discussion. I think what we see is that there's an increasing generational gap in the way that diversity and inclusion is defined. So a recent study by Deloitte and the Billie Jean King Initiative, which is supported by Teneo Holdings, so Kim can speak very much to this information. This research shows that there's a growing generational gap in how diversity and inclusion is defined in today's workplaces. So if we look at millennials, who will comprise nearly 75% of the workforce by 2025, these millennials believe inclusion is a support for a collaborative environment that values open participation from individuals with different ideas and perspectives and the unique factors that contribute to their personalities and behaviors. So this is in stark contrast to prior generations who traditionally consider diversity and inclusion from the perspectives of representation, so having diverse boards, for instance, women on boards, and assimilation. So with that, I'll actually turn to the speakers and ask for each of you to offer a brief view as to how you define diversity and inclusion in both your personal and professional working lives. With that, I think I'll start off with Kim Davis, if you'd like to provide your view.
I wonder if she's on mute.
Yeah, I was just about to say, Kim, it looks like you may be on mute. So, Evan, since it seems your audio is working super, how about we turn it to you?
I jumped to the front of the line by virtue of technology. So I'm here in a couple of different contexts. I mean, first and foremost, because this issue is important to me, I think it's important to business. Ultimately, what the exchanges are trying to do is create more business productive environments, not only for better returns economically, but better returns socially and environmentally in a lot of different ways. So I have been working closely with two global stock exchange partnerships on all kinds of environmental, social, and governance metrics. Basically, how corporates are performing in certain areas, and gender is certainly, and gender parity and gender diversity and equality and opportunity is a big part of that effort. So one of the efforts, as Susie mentioned in the intro, the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, which is about 4.5 years old now, has at last count 57 exchange members, so well over 80% of all the stock exchanges on the planet are members, and they're committed to delivering on development goals such as the Sustainable Development Goals, but global goals that advance business and advance society in partnership. So this is a direct partnership between businesses and civil society and NGOs and governments to some extent, trying to reach some very ambitious targets by the time we get to year 2030. Some are environmental, but some are definitely social and corporate governance related. I also, as you mentioned, chaired the WFE Sustainability Working Group, which is a task force that was created out of our trade association. There are about 28 exchange members in that group, a lot of crossover between the two groups, a lot of diversity in the exchange participants themselves, large and small, New York, NASDAQ, London, also Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, China, India. I mean, if you just think about the economies and the governments and the particular market scenarios around each of those different locations, you can see it's a very diverse group. But they all sort of have diversity, inclusion, and gender equity in mind. That's a part of the mission that we're trying to achieve. And so last year, the task force, the WFE Sustainability Working Group, put out a recommendation to all stock exchanges around the planet saying, basically, these are the indicators, the environmental, social, and governance indicators that we think are the most revelatory and insightful when it comes to long-term company health. And four of the 33, are concerned directly with gender. We asked for the ratio of gender pay throughout the org chart, from beginning salaries all the way up through C-suite. We asked for general diversity stats, male versus female, throughout the org chart. Of course, non-discrimination policies in effect to sort of facilitate equitable promotion of talent through the value chain. And then we also asked specifically about board diversity. Board diversity in this case is not limited to male-female. We think that there's a value in having a diverse board in terms of experience and nationality and business acumen. So there's a lot of different diverse perspectives that make up a strong and a high-functioning board. But gender is certainly one of them. There are all kinds of interesting correlations that happen when you put more women on the board. I don't think it'll be a surprise to anybody on this call. Some of the ones that have to do with lower costs of capital and higher shareholder return and lower shareholder turnover. These could be correlative, they could be causational, we don't know, but there is a connection. And then I'm encouraged by things like there was a Washington Post article a few months ago that talks about more companies with more women on boards are less acquisitional. The number of acquisitions goes down significantly when you have more women on boards, which is an interesting thing. Some people look at that stat and they say, well, there's a risk aversion piece to having more women on the board, so obviously they're not going to go after, potentially risky business moves, but since most of those mergers and acquisitions fail, and a lot of them don't accrete to the bottom line very quickly or very well, you could say that they're bringing a more rigorous discipline to the decision-making process when it comes to that. So it's interesting that all these dynamics start to open up when you look at more diversity and inclusion in the different aspects of your organization throughout the value chain. And I think part of the problem with the board's, quote, not having enough women candidates is that we're not bringing them through the talent chain quite often enough, especially this is quite obvious in areas like tech, where we've had an ongoing story in the U.S. about the lack of talent, female talent in tech. But this happens in virtually every business. You see the percentage drop-off in terms of female participation from the entry-level point to middle management to senior management to C-suite to board. It's almost a straight line down, and it's not adequately explained by life and family choices. There are factors that you can put into the analysis that help to account for those choices that women make more often than men. still, but it does not fully explain the dynamic. So there's obviously something else going on there, and maybe we can get to that a little bit later. But I just want to give you a flavor for how the stock exchanges are working towards greater parity and greater disclosure and transparency around this, because I think the first step here is we need better data. We need to understand what the dynamic is. Is there truly a gap? Is there truly a leadership performance and or pay gap? How great is that gap? Is it more pervasive in certain industries or certain countries? And exchanges are trying to find a way to understand it and close it, as well as businesses.
Yeah, thank you, Evan.
I'm back online, Susan. Sorry about that, Kim.
No problem. Glad you're back online. So with that, would you like to follow up?
Thank you. And Evan said such wonderful context. Much like Evan, for me, this is very personal, as well as I've spent my career focusing on important leadership issues surrounding women, and specifically women of color, and of course have been involved in this as I have been in the world of work for over 35 years. I think when you begin to talk about diversity and inclusion, you have to start with the ever-shifting demographic landscape globally. And in the United States specifically, if you just think about the work that the Pew Research Center did recently, they said that in the next 20 years, no single group will be a majority in the United States. So as Evan said, diversity is not just limited to gender and race. It is not just about those things. However, as Professor Kim Crenshaw has written extensively about, it really is the intersectionality of everything that we all bring to the table. Our different generational perspectives, obviously gender, but our abilities, our culture, our sexual orientations, and our background. And I firmly believe, particularly in this extremely contentious environment where race and ethnicity and inequalities are once again a topic of conflict and conversation, I think leaders, and specifically CEOs, have to begin to create an environment where we can have authentic conversations inside corporations, which are nothing more than a microcosm of society, to demonstrate that both companies and its leadership are committed to change. So diversity is truly about valuing and promoting this mix, this intersectionality of the differences and the similarities and the unique characteristics that individuals and groups bring to the workplace. But inclusion, layered on top of that, is really about empowering and leveraging diversity, particularly in the workforce, by truly enabling individuals to contribute their fullest potential, allowing people to bring their full selves to the corporation and their organizations. And if you think about the cultures of organizations, all organizational cultures are really underpinned by a set of shared values. And much of this work in the diversity and inclusion space is really about organizations holding themselves to the set of stated values that they talk about. And what is it that an organization is going to do to look within their culture, look at its unspoken rules and practices, to really make this mix that we talk about in diversity work. And in doing this, ultimately creating an environment where people can contribute their full selves and contribute heavily to business growth and profitability. An important question that I hope we can discuss and debate, as Evan talked about the statistics, and there's so many more statistics. One of the wonderful things about this 2.0, if you will, business case for diversity and inclusion is this new revolution in the D&I space that is really being built on what the data says. And so why is it that when the facts say that there should be more diversity in upper management and on boards, when the facts speak to this, why is it that it's not so? Is it an inertia effect? Is it something about culture? Is it something about unspoken rules? Is it something about the difference between what we say the cost of entry is and what the actual cost of entry is? So these are the things that I'm hoping we can explore.
Thank you, Kim. It brings up a very key point. A key focus of today's conversation is the importance of transparency. So with that, I'll actually pass it on to Hedda, who I think you can speak quite a bit to transparency from your personal investor perspective.
Bringing up the rear from Europe, from Luxembourg. Yes, thanks so much, Susie. And I love listening to Evan and Kim speak. It's such an honor to be on this webinar with them. Lots of interesting data and perspectives. And let me see if I can add mine and see if I can add some value through the eyes of an investor, a private investor in the early stage, and also, again, from Europe. You know, looking back at the statistics and data that you showed on some of the diversity and the performance of organizations with diversity, I would say as an investor, diversity equals good business. That's a starting point. So I represent different funds that do early stage investing, whether it's microfinance, where we look at developing countries and, you know, the world's most poor in rural areas, and of course women were a fantastic investment opportunity. Then I have a women's angel fund called Rising Tide, which we're trying to change the face of capital to really encourage more women entrepreneurs to get out there. But through OmniSource and TIIME, where I do this social investing activity, I really look at social inclusion, and I love where there's a minority that's not kind of representative in an organization that I'm investing and working with. I ask myself why, or why not, or how do we get them involved? And as we said, it goes beyond gender or race. I look at business models that look at people with disabilities who have special abilities, like using autistic people for software testing, or using the elderly in different contexts. A wonderful project in Austria that uses elderly for a cafe, the best cakes ever. So social inclusion is something that's part of my investment strategy, and obviously gender lens investing, looking at the role that women play, is also something that's close to my heart. When people ask me to identify what is diversity for me, obviously, like social impact, when people say, well, you're a social investor, what does that mean? It has different meanings in different contexts, and it really varies where you are in the world. And I always reflect on this book, and the Name of Identity by Amin Maalouf. I don't know if you guys have come across that, but they say that we always identify ourselves by the element of who we are that feels most threatened. So diversity is going to play along delicate lines depending on where you are, and I really always come back to this point on the same answer for what is social impact, what does that mean, and social inclusion. It always comes to this topic of diversity, as you mentioned, Susie, and the fact that on a macro level we're looking for clear and honest data, and on a micro level it's and where our personal journeys are is some kind of self-awareness about our unconscious bias and our patterns, and to recognize your own biases and stereotypes and privileges, and getting away from a blindness to these elements and starting to make a kind of more positive move in that space. So I think that would just be my general thoughts on the topic, and I know we have a lot of content to get through, so I'll stop with that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's very exciting because I think, you know, clearly we have different perspectives represented from the stock exchange, so market regulators, the corporate view, and then the investor view kind of coming together. And the view that I represent from eRevalue is really the data view, and what does the data actually tell us. And I think what we're seeing with data is that these issues are hard to measure, because they can't necessarily be distilled down into numerical values. They are values-based types issues, so it's really about how can we understand what companies themselves are saying in one hand, but also actually doing around these types of issues. But before we jump into what we see happening on that macro level, Hedda, as you'd mentioned, let's actually go to the audience and poll you to ask for your opinion. So we have developed a poll. The poll is really asking for your view on what does a culture of inclusion mean to you. By nature of the poll, you'll have a series of multiple choice questions or answers that you can choose from. So we will just kick that off now. So the poll is in progress. And the question is, what does a culture of inclusion mean to you? And there are 4 responses. The first response asks where there are many races and ethnicities represented. The second one asks where CEO or leaders value opinions and encourage diversity and inclusion. The third response is referring to where there are processes and policies in place for employees within the HR community. And the fourth is talking about where employees value and recognize the importance of diversity and inclusion. So as the polls are coming in, it seems to be leaning towards both having leadership really valuing diversity of opinions, but also where employees themselves are valuing and recognizing this. So it's very much about the culture. So less so about the employee resource groups and HR policies, less so about race and ethnicity being represented in a diversity of ways, which it's very much in line with the generational gap we were just speaking to as well. Great. So with that, I think, let's dive in and talk about some of those developments that we're seeing on the macro level, and then we'll jump right back into the conversation. But just to set the stage, one of the things that we've talked about, Evan, you had mentioned this too, is the idea of requiring board diversity of representation on boards. We see that globally there's this push to have quotas, so a certain percentage of representation of boards being female. And what we've seen is that maybe this approach is not very effective. Workforce diversity and inclusion is quickly moving to the top of the global regulatory agenda, so it is becoming a must-have for businesses globally. Until recently, it's predominantly focused on this topic of gender. So we've seen gender quotas in European countries since 2004, when it was first introduced by Norway, where they required state-owned companies to actually have a certain percentage of women represented on the board, 40%. Non-compliance is obviously subject to penalties such as warnings, fines, and delisting. One thing, I think we just have to close the poll in order for you to actually see what's on my screen. So let's do that. There we go. All right, you should now be able to see what I'm actually speaking to on our screen. We see that quotas are still taking place in European countries predominantly. So these are 2 recent examples here on the screen, looking at an act for the equal participation of women and men in leadership positions. That's in Germany, as well as the proposal for a directive on improving gender balance. But the question is, are quotas effective? Generally, what we're seeing is that the snowball doesn't roll very far. So in May 2016, there's a Swedish author who released a book called The Nordic Gender Equality Paradox. And the research in this book shows that the effects of quotas in Norway were far from positive. So this led the author to conclude that quotas are nothing more than window dressing, so to speak. This applies for U.S. Fortune 500 companies who are not under a similar quota system. What we're actually seeing here is that these Fortune 500 companies in the U.S. who do not have to abide by a specific quota are actually more apt to appoint women to chief executive positions. So what is going to actually make the snowball roll? In the regulatory space, we're starting to see more specific focus on the say on pay. So we're seeing that there's more regulatory push for pay ratio disclosure, so it's getting a bit more concrete. The legal courtroom is really focusing on issues like fair remuneration and gender pay gaps, asking companies to disclose this information. On the screen here, you see some recent initiatives, including the gender pay gap information in the UK. There's also the EU directive for the disclosure of non-financial and diversity information. And I think here in the US, we're also following the recent SEC's concept release on Regulation SK, which is raising questions about the advisability of mandatory disclosure on issues like pay ratios. But we see that it's not just the legal courtroom that's actually demanding change. There's also the courtroom of public opinion, the public which, with the advent of social media, with the advent of the internet, has never been more influential. If we look at some recent social media trends, so this information is actually information that comes from eRevalue's Datamoran platform, where we're analyzing how these issues evolve in the media landscape, in the regulatory landscape, and in the corporate disclosure landscape. What we can see is that there are multiple actors shaping the global agenda around these issues, from pop culture to politics. We can see that more attention tends to be placed on issues like fair remuneration versus workforce diversity and inclusion. So what you see here on the screen is actually the number of tweets that are taking place around these topics over time. So we can see that these regulatory demands, these public demands, are really reinforcing the need for companies to speak up and act on these issues. So companies understand that the onus is on them to be vocal around their diversity and inclusion efforts, and corporate reporting is just one way to do this. So we'll jump back into the conversation, but just to set the stage, the question is, does disclosure actually disprove lip service? Do we actually see that the data is indicative of real change internally at corporations, which, as Kim had mentioned, are really, microcosms of the broader society? So what we're looking here is we're looking at disclosure trends over time on 4 key topics related to diversity and inclusion. And this is based on an analysis we did at eRevalue, looking at both annual financial reports, but also annual non-financial reports or sustainability reports. And what we can see in the non-financial reporting is that there's more attention placed on the topic of workforce diversity and inclusion than on issues like executive compensation and board composition. In financial reports, however, where there's more of a regulatory structure to disclosure, we can see that topics like executive compensation or fair remuneration are generally more heavily addressed. So what we're doing here is actually measuring the relative level of emphasis placed on these issues across all industries globally, which covers about 6,500 companies worldwide. So it's important to note that we do actually see increasing disclosure on these topics, but the question remains, is this disclosure indicative of real change? So with that, I think, the first question is, can companies change fast enough? And how can they actually do that? So this is a question that I'll direct to Kim, since Kim, you have a direct experience engaging with corporations on these issues. We see that the World Economic Forum predicts that it will take quite some time for us to actually achieve gender pay parity at the global level. So what do you recommend? How can companies change and change more quickly?
From my perspective, I think the pace of change at which a company moves is largely dependent on the CEO. I really believe that it is the chief executive's job to own the company's values and to integrate them at every level of the business. I often say that the CEO is truly the chief diversity officer, and so that change does have to start at the top. However, it is clear, and we have said, that there are so many systemic and institutional barriers that prevent the kind of movement that we need and create the inertia that I spoke about earlier. When you talk about the notion of disclosure disproving lip service, if you think about over the past couple of years, a lot of leading organizations have begun releasing their internal numbers and divulging the demographics of their companies. You'll recall that Microsoft's reporting of its internal demographics, they received a lot of criticism. It was noted that a few of the data points were actually absent in their report, namely promotion velocity and retention data, that being that the company didn't disclose the rate at which minorities were receiving promotions or how long non-white and female employees were actually lasting in the culture, which are critically important elements to understand where the issues in the pipeline occur. But the question for me in can companies change fast enough really goes back to what all three of us have been saying, and that is, what is it about the culture of the company that prevents the kind of change that we need? I think about that within the context of those unstated rules or unspoken rules inside of an organization. And let me give one quick example. So if we talk about representation on boards as an example, think about one dimension, the dimension that I call cost of entry. So a board individual must know the industry, they must have strong financial acumen, and they should have a very strong point of view. That sounds simply easy to measure, and in fact that opens up a pretty broad playing field for you to select from. However, if the unspoken rule underpinning that is that I'm looking, I CEO, I chair of board, am looking for an individual that has a reservoir of shared experiences like myself, that significantly narrows the playing field. So I think we can't simply just talk about can companies change fast enough. We have to talk about what will it take about culture for us to really see the kind of change that's going to be necessary.
Definitely. I think it is a cultural change. So the regulatory and public demands are one side of the coin. And I think, when we think about how companies can communicate what they are doing to actually change, it really becomes, a way for the external stakeholders to make their own interpretations on what a company is doing to address that type of cultural shift. So with that, Hedda, from the investor perspective, why is diversity a metric for investment decisions? We're seeing that more and more investors are actually considering diversity as an important metric to their investment decision making. There's been a 40% increase in the number of assets under management that have really started to focus on these types of issues. So why is diversity a metric for investment decisions, and how can companies demonstrate change and inspire confidence within the investment community?
I have the advantage of working in early stage investing where the companies I invest in, it just becomes part of their base value that I can actually get engaged in right from the start. Diversity and inclusion is it's part of the mission. It becomes a lot more complicated when you have large companies that have been around for a long time who are trying to implement these types of changes. But I find that in the mainstream diversity like CSR, it's been a little bit of lip service. But the fact that we're having these debates and discussions like now creates a sense of urgency and attention. In the space of socially responsible investing, which obviously is a class in itself, it's more fundamental. It's a ground rule, and rather than just this kind of negative screening of trying to take out the yucky stuff, we're seeing more sophisticated tools to measure and define targets, because it's just one of these basic requisites for social investing or socially responsible investing. So an example, again, to try to be tangible, is there's an organization called Women Effect, run by Susanne, which I know Kim knows, and I'm sure some of you have also come across, which provides gender lens investing tools from due diligence to monitoring, and that helps provide decision making, all the way from the executive level to supply chain to how the products and services are being designed with women and girls in focus. So what I'm seeing is kind of more sophisticated tools to bring us further than the lip service of, yes, diversity is important, it's good for business. So I recognize a trend that we're moving from more qualitative and anecdotal information and nice stories to something more solid in terms of non-financial returns, and that's gaining relevance in investment decisions, and quantitative tools like eRevalue start indicating a trend towards more sophisticated methodologies, and I think that's an important sign. Is it moving fast enough? No, it never would be for anybody like me. I don't think Kim or Evan would claim that it's moving fast enough, but This type of transparency and discussion and data definitely creates the urgency and the priority around the issues.
Yeah, and talking about data, I think, Evan, in our call before that we went live today, you were saying data has the power to dismantle myths. That's something I think everyone on this call can agree with. So from the stock exchange perspective, you already spoke to this guidance and recommendation that was issued by the WFE at the end of 2015. Why is guidance important in this respect, and what do you think that this type of guidance, how do you think it will actually impact company performance and the dialogue between investors and other types of external stakeholders?
Well, I mean, that's where exchanges are really uniquely positioned to be a part of this discussion because, when you think about it, we're positioned between issuers, investors, and regulators. The exchanges are essentially running markets where all of these players come to the table and expect a fair and equitable sort of voice in how the market should be run fairly and their opinions respected in terms of the kinds of data that each party needs in order to do their job effectively. So we're sensitive to the fact that companies have limited resources. They're trying to be disclosure-oriented and put information into the mix that investors and regulators ask for. We are especially and increasingly sensitive to the concerns that investors have about these, quote, non-financial metrics, such as gender, diversity, and inclusion being great indicators of company health and performance, in some cases better or the equal to the financial indicators that we've been churning out quarter after quarter, year after year. And then the regulators who are trying to find, the right balance between the two as well. So in some ways, the exchanges are uniquely positioned in that area to sort of meet the needs of all three and make sure that they're common sense applications for their expectations in terms of market performance. And in terms of the company perspective, the companies that list on our exchanges, they're already getting squeezed for this information. I mean, even if we weren't part of this discussion, they're already hearing from their investors. They're getting letters from their investors. They're hearing from their investors who are members of PRI or other organizations that have an agenda that is meant to be a little bit more progressive and active as an owner. They're certainly hearing from their suppliers. They have a supply chain which is often global, crosses a lot of boundaries. Their suppliers are under increased scrutiny from governments and other places to disclose their performance on things like inclusion and gender performance, and so that trickles up in this case to the companies. So the companies are being squeezed from below from those elements as well. Exchanges, we're interested in this from a number of different perspectives, not just the market stability part, but also, a lot of the exchanges are indexers, and they're interested in creating indexes of companies that are outperforming or signal performing on a certain kind of operational excellence. And so we find that we don't really have NASDAQ per se doesn't have a gender equity index per se, but a lot of exchanges do, and they're lightly transacted, but they get some attention, and they serve as a great way to bring attention to companies that are outperforming others in terms of presence in that index. Dow Jones Sustainability Index and FTSE for Good are the two most prominent, but there are lots of others out there. But generally, with the whole point behind data, and Susie mentioned my quote earlier, which is true, I think that data is the power to dismantle mythology. I have to go into boardrooms and C-suites all the time with data to sort of talk about why we should be doing these, quote, non-financial performance indicators and why we should convince companies to disclose them voluntarily in most cases because it's in their best interest. And that's because there are all kinds of financial returns that are associated with doing so. If I told a CEO that you could have lower investor turnover, which has a dollar attached to it, dollar amount attached to it, if I told the CEO that you would have better recruit and retention rates of your workforce, which has a dollar impact attached to it, it's almost like I could say whatever the next part of that sentence is, they'd be interested. And I said that, well, diversity and inclusion is a key part of making that happen. But the exchanges are really trying to set a global baseline. They're trying to find a way so that all of the public marketplaces around the world essentially have the same starting point for listed companies. If you're going to take dollars from investors anywhere in the world, you have to give us some indication of your performance on things like gender diversity and inclusion. And that helps to not only take some of the competitive arbitrage out. You don't want to force companies to an exchange that has a lower barrier to entry so that they're just, there's essentially a less transparent venue for them because it's easier to go to market, but also because there's real value in facilitating cross-border investment. We want a U.S. investor to look at places like Malaysia and look at places like China and vice versa and say their standards for corporate behavior and responsibility are the same as ours, and I can be confident that I can look at other metrics to sort of determine whether my dollar should go to that place or not. So there's a lot of reasons why the exchanges are involved. Data, I think, is an essential part. I think we're in the part of this discussion now where we need to get more data into the mix. It needs to be better data, and once we get to that baseline, once we get to the point where we have verifiable data from virtually every public company on earth in the mix, then there's all kinds of interesting things that we can do with it. Big data things, indexing things, all kinds of insights that we don't even know because we don't have a great data mix to look at right now. We don't even know exactly how something like gender performance is tied to other kinds of performance until we get that data picture in line.
Great, yeah, so it's really a competitive advantage in multiple ways. I mean, minimizing risk. We see these issues are moving, you know, from voluntary requirements to mandatory requirements increasingly. So those companies already disclosing information on this are ahead of the game, so to speak. But with that, I see we have about 10 more minutes remaining, so I would love to pass it on to the audience and start the Q&A and hear from you. What kinds of questions or thoughts do you have based on what we've been talking about today? I'm just going to open up the questions here to make sure that I can actually see that. So please. So there's a question here that says, given many CEO positions still reside with men, what are the most important factors in convincing them to become champions for diversity? Kim, I think that's a question well placed for you to respond to.
Sure. One of the things that I have well learned over many years, and Billie Jean King has been a great teacher of this, is the notion that we have to engage men, particularly white men in positions of power, in this conversation around diversity and in the solution making around diversity in a way that's not punitive, but in a way that engages around, as Evan has said, around the facts and the data, and bringing that together so that we are making a solid case based on this new revolution of data. And so for me, it starts with that. It starts with the data. It starts by looking at much that's out there already. Data that says that the purchasing power of Latino and Black consumer is each exceeding an estimated $1 trillion, and that racial and ethnic minorities are now more relevant than ever in driving economic growth. The data that says that when purchasing decisions are made in the UK, for example, 80% of purchasing decisions are made by women, and in the next 7 years, women are expected to own 60% of all personal wealth. Tying diversity and inclusion to economic indicators and how businesses are going to need to focus on not only the economics of their business, but innovation and creativity, and having the CEO lead those discussions, for me, will be one of the key ways that we will begin to break down some of the barriers that exist.
Great. Hedda or Evan, do you have anything to add to that?
Evan, you're going to have to go last because you represent the people that we're trying to talk about. So you're the guy, white guy that we need to get on board. But I thought I wanted to share a little anecdote from a session in Portugal, where I was introducing this women effect and gender lens investing and how it's such a great investment strategy, and showing similar data that you did, Susanne, when we opened up on women-led businesses and tech, etc. And it's funny because you have to circumnavigate some sensitive points, and Kim, I know you also kind of touched upon this, and that's the fact that if you start saying that women are, or suggesting that women are better than men, you're going to have a very opposite reaction to the kind of working and collaborating towards it. And I remember there was a guy in the group who says, what are you trying to tell us, that like women are better and women entrepreneurs are better? And I was a bit delicate, and I said, quite honestly, the women that are statistically analyzed for this, the women that have broken through all the glass ceilings to get their businesses to the level where they're analyzed, they are overachievers, and they probably work through more than you can imagine to get there. So that's why you're seeing this type of data. I thought that was a pretty diplomatic response. And then I reshifted the conversation to the fact that we're not talking about if women are better than men, etc. We're talking about diversity and how they can work together to achieve better results. And once you put it on that level, and also in any of the discussions around engaging minorities or marginalized groups, you start having a different type of conversations. It just needs to get out of the mode of who's better, what's better, and saying how do we kind of jointly solve this and move in the right direction. So I like to do these funds where I have women angel investing to show that there's a new face, not just for women entrepreneurs, but for men entrepreneurs, to say investor is not, necessarily a white older man. You have all sorts of shapes and sizes, from the entrepreneurs to the people investing. And the more examples we have and the more noise we have about all these different types of projects. And I know, Kim, I told you about Grassroots that tries to look at women of color that are trying to get seed capital, and how much more difficult it is for them to access the family, friends, and fools that perhaps a white counterpart can access, and how they're generating funds and systems and support services there as well. So we need more examples, we need more inspiration, and I think if we can do that, we're moving in the right direction. And with that, Evan, you get to decide, are you convinced by myself and Kim and Susie? Are you on board?
I disagree entirely. No, I agree. In fact, I'm going to say what you just said with slightly different words and take credit for it. But to me, we can talk all day about changing the hearts and minds of male CEOs, male white CEOs, and trying to get them more attuned to the idea of women in power, but we just need more of them. When you're talking about a country in the U.S. where we have 5% of the S&P 500 CEOs are women, it's extraordinarily low. 19% of the women, of the positions on board seats are held by women. It's just, we're so far from parity that we have done a disservice to rising girls and women in the corporate value chain. We have not normalized the idea of women in positions of power and influence in U.S. business in particular. It's changed a little bit in Europe because of the quota regimen, but I think we have a particular problem all over the world in terms of women being brought through from entry level all the way up to the board. I think that we need more visible examples of women in these positions to sort of inspire and educate and bring talent in line with what men have enjoyed for hundreds of years. This is in addition to the business impacts. I can demonstrate through data the business impacts of having a more diverse workplace, a more diverse executive team, a more diverse board. But there are lots of other sort of morale and sort of intangible aspects to improving your performance in that way. I think that, there's a quote I remember from the Harvard Business Review where they were talking about women on boards in particular, and they said something about a board that has a diverse range of perspectives leads to something, an environment of collaborative tension that is the essence of good governance. And I'd suggest that a company that has a diverse range of employees leads to a collaborative tension that's the essence of good business, because then you're going to be able to empower people with different skill sets to do different jobs more properly. You're going to have a source of innovation that you're denying yourself from right now. You're going to be in better touch with customers who are more in line with their values, and then you're just bringing a different set of skills and disciplines to the table. So the fact that companies would be ignoring this kind of fuel source for running their company efficiently is a sign of dysfunction. And I think that the more that we can raise the ranks and make this the standard operating procedure or expectation is parity, then I think that the better off companies will be, the better off people will be.
And can I just add, Evan, and you alluded to this, it is really important for white males to bring voice to the issues that you've just outlined. It's an interesting study that was published in Harvard Business Review this year that was conducted by the University of Colorado that suggested that when women and minorities in senior positions talk about diversity and inclusion, they are actually penalized. And the study went on to say that it is really important that white males in positions of power talk about these issues the way you've just spoken about them in order for us to really shift the paradigm. So that is a point worth mentioning and one that we really have to stay focused on.
I agree 100%, and I think that, I've had conversations with women CEOs who are reluctant to be on the record on this topic because they don't want to be pigeonholed as a women's issue leader. So the fact that you have a small group of leaders in the space who are maybe more reluctant to be on the record and make this their single issue sort of perspective, and then you have this sort of natural reticence of the white male power structure talking about everything else or ignoring this problem, you've got sort of a double whammy of problems that we need to address.
And of course, an ever-present example of that was CEO of Sam's Club, Roz Brewer, who was personally attacked and her family threatened as a result of her having a very honest and open, transparent conversation about diversity.
Yes.
That's ugly. But then we also have examples like Indra Nooyi from Pepsi who are sending a completely other message. So, wow, we really have to focus in on the good stories and make sure they come out loud and clear.
That's exactly right.
Great. Well, there are a lot of resources we've referenced, and I see that we are at the top of the hour almost. So I think, after the webinar, for everyone listening, we will send a recording of the webinar, but also I think it would be helpful to just get some of those great studies we've been referencing and include those as attachments and links as well. So with that, I think this is a conversation that will continue. Undoubtedly, it's an important subject politically, culturally. So really just summing up, what's been discussed so far, I think there are 3 key points. The first is we really see that there's a shift in the global understanding of diversity and inclusion. This is going way beyond race and gender. We see that diverse representation does not automatically equal a culture of inclusiveness. There's a lot more change that needs to happen at the ground level, both at the top of the organization, but also at the bottom. It's a trickle-down effect. And transparency is key. Data has the power to dismantle myths, and it provides a platform for engagement, but a platform for competitive advantage as well for many companies. So with that, it is the top of the hour. Evan, Hedda, Kim, are there any final comments you'd like to wrap up today's conversation before we say goodbye and thanks to all the participants?
Oh, I would just say I'm truly encouraged by the future, particularly because of millennials and this notion of the courtroom of public opinion. I think that the dialogue is already shifting, and with the data that we have access to, I think that we have many opportunities in the future.
I'll just add that I think having this conversation and just listening to everybody speaking and knowing that we're having these open discussions and really pushing things forward, and that eRevalue is behind this, it also makes me feel very, very positive for the future. So let's keep going in the right direction. Let's keep sharing inspiration and positive stories, and we'll have to deal with the side effects. And we know that there are some unhappy stories, but we're going to have to keep working through them until we get it right.
Yeah, and I'll just say that I think in a lot of ways this is lining up to be yet another year of the woman. We always talk about the year of the woman, but this is, there are a lot of things that are coming together this year, politically, economically, that seem to indicate that we're going to have more prominent women in positions of leadership. We're certainly having more and more women in positions of leadership at stock exchanges, which is a unique thing, including our own. So, I think that, the more visible and authentic the parity in terms of leadership is in all of these different institutions, the easier it'll be to have this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Evan, Kim, Hedda, for participating in today's discussion, and thank you, Kim and Teneo Holdings, for co-hosting today's webinar. A big thanks to all of our participants for listening in. Again, we'll send over a recording along with some follow-up materials so we can keep the dialogue going offline. The contact details of our speakers are also included in the presentation, so you can follow up directly with any one of them for any specific questions that you may have. But with that, I'll say thanks very much from here in Chicago. Have a great rest of the day, a great rest of the night for everyone listening in, and look forward to continuing the dialogue offline.